Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stephen here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. Today is a brew talk, maybe a short one because I have kind of talked about this before, but the thing is I see this come up over and over. And there's kind of a double thing here to talk about. So I want to talk about racking your beer. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is an incorrect term that causes a lot of confusion, especially if you're asking someone for help whether you should do something or not do something, and you use the wrong term, it can become confusing. So the question in this video is, do you transfer your beer to another vessel or not? Okay, first of all, let's talk about the term. You'll hear this term secondary all the time. People will ask, especially because, you know, you might see it in a recipe or something, but people will ask, should I, or, you know, I think people may also hear this just through the grapevine. They'll say, you know, I'm transferring my beer to a secondary, or, you know, when should I start a secondary? I want to be clear about this because I'm not sure why it's so confusing, but secondary has nothing to do with transferring your beer to another vessel. If you hear the term secondary, secondary refers to secondary fermentation. Transferring your beer from one vessel to another does not create a secondary fermentation. You're literally just moving your beer. Secondary fermentation is when you add adjuncts after your beer is fermented. Maybe you add some fruit and that kicks up fermentation because there's sugar in the fruit. Or maybe you add hops. Actually, dry hops can cause fermentation to start again. So anything you add in after the primary fermentation is done that starts up fermentation again would be a secondary fermentation. That's secondary. It has nothing to do with moving your beer from one vessel to another. What we're talking about, and what gets confused, is called racking your beer. If you rack your beer, you're moving it from one vessel to another. Now, the question is it something you should do? And if it is, why should you do it? Well, the first thing that I would say is it's risky. It's risky almost all the time unless you're doing a really strict no oxygen transfer, which I'm not going to get to in this video. But for the most part, for the average home brewer, moving your beer from one vessel to another usually involves like an auto siphon. And I talked about this in a prior video that auto siphons create more oxygen and splashing than you might think. Certainly better than just pouring your beer from one vessel to another, but there is still oxygen that is getting into your beer, finished beer, every time you try to rack it like that. So it's risky. It's risky. Why would you want to move your beer and rack it into another vessel? Well, the main reason I can think of is aging. If you're not going to age your beer in bottles and bottle condition, and you're just wanting to keep it in one single vessel, then you rack it to get it off of the yeast. If your beer stays on that yeast cake for too long, you get autolyse, where the yeast breaks down and can release some pretty gross flavors back into your beer. So if you're aging beer for a period of time, now when I say period of time, I leave my beer on the yeast cake for about 2 months total. About a month while it's fermenting and a month while I'm pouring off of it. So for sure, 2 months is not going to cause a problem, especially if you're not moving it around and jostling it. You're just letting it sit wherever it's at. However, if you're aging your beer for like 6 months, you're lagering it, whatever you're doing, you would want to take it off of the yeast cake. And I won't get into this video on how you do that, but for sure, a very low or no oxygen transfer is the way to go if you have to do that. So aging is one reason why you'd move or rack your beer into another vessel. Some people say it helps to clear the beer. I think that's a misnomer, in my personal opinion, and from what I've read and my experience. Time will clear your beer. Moving it off the trub would actually potentially stir up the yeast in trub, and then you'd end up with more cloudiness and less clear, in your beer. You'll still get flocculation over time, no matter what, but moving it off of that yeast cake is not really that's not what's gonna clear your beer up. It's letting it just sit. It just takes time. Anyway, I think unless you are aging your beer, right, then the risks outweigh the benefits of racking it off into another vessel. There isn't really need to. So how do you get around this? Because there is this issue where if you have fermented your beer in a bucket, for example, let's say you're using like one of those food grade Home Depot buckets, like from the hardware store, and that's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that. However, you can't serve your beer off of that because it's not pressurized or pressurizable. If that's a word. So what do you have to do? You have to move it. You have to rack your beer from that bucket into a keg or bottles, in order to get it ready for drinking. So you don't have a choice in that matter. You have to move that beer if you're going to move it into a vessel to serve it one way or another. Or, like I say, bottles. If you get to the point where you're not really bottling a lot, because you'll quickly find bottling is a hassle. It's sort of a necessary evil to bottle a few of them, maybe for friends or something. But at least for me, I never bottle an entire batch anymore. It's a lot of work and hassle. That being said, I try to make my brew day as easy and simple with the least amount of cleanup as I can. And so I use a pressurized fermenter. Now you can get different kinds. The one I have is the all-rounder, and I have, I think, 3 of them now. And I've just moved to that. I don't even use it. My corny kegs are out in the garage collecting dust. These all-rounders are a fantastic replacement for corny kegs. They are a different shape. They're big, round, bulbous things as opposed to the more cylinder size of a, corny keg, but they also hold more. I think 7.5 gallons or something like that. So you can do a 5-gallon batch and have plenty of headroom for the fermentation. So how do you serve off of it? So what I do is I ferment most of my beers for a month in the fermenter. They sit in a temperature-controlled freezer in that fermenter for a month, and then I put them. I move it over to the kegerator to carbonate, and I let it slow carb for a week. So how do you pour from it and not get all the yeast and trub? You use a floating dip tube. They're super inexpensive, really, in comparison to everything. I have a number of them at this point. But they're basically, instead of having that long metal tube that goes down your corny keg that pulls the beer from the bottom of your keg, it just floats. It's a not rubber, it's probably, synthetic tube that connects to usually a little filter. It doesn't have to. Some people don't have a filter. I mean, as long as you're pulling from the top of the keg, that is a benefit. Most of them do come with filters now where the end of the tube plugs into a little filter, like a mesh filter. And that way, if there is any particulates or trub, Croissant hanging out at the top, it's probably not going to draw that in because it's got the filter on top of that. Anyway, so that allows you, especially if you let it slow carb for a week, most of the yeast and stuff is going to fall out of suspension, and the stuff at the top of your beer is pretty clear anyway and good to go. So that, and you also don't have to run the risk of oxidation, if you're transferring the beer, because it never leaves that vessel. So it's the best possible beer really that you can get, because you're not touching it, you're letting it slowly cold crash, and you're pulling it through a filter from the top of the beer. Anyway, that's what I do, and that's my thoughts on whether you should transfer your beer or not. Only if you have to. Only if you have to. All right, well, that's it for this week. I will be back in another week with another video or homebrew day. I'm still working on making some edits to a couple brew days. So I'm a little behind, but they're coming. They are coming. So I will see you soon, and until then, keep on brewing.